Hey everyone, I wanted to make a quick video for a topic that I didn't get to in class today. And that is writing the equation for a given sine or cosine graph. So we want to write an equation for these guys. And these are going to be, and again, we've got y equals a times either the sine or cosine, whatever you have, of bx minus c plus d. Um, so we want to write an equation for these graphs. In class, we've been working with, if you're given an equation, how do you graph it? This is going backwards. So how are we going to do this? Let's start with number one. So in order to start doing this, we are going to find our period, our amplitude, and our phase shift. We don't have an equation, so we're going to get these things from the graph. So let's figure out what the period of this function is. Again, the period is the time that it takes horizontally, like the distance, I suppose, horizontally, for this function to kind of complete a whole cycle. So I think it's easiest to start at 0. So if we start at 0 and we start tracing our function, how long does it take for this thing to finish the whole function, to finish the whole cycle and start over again? Do you see that once I get here to 8 pi, that same pattern starts over again? This point and this point. If you move to the right, it's exactly the same pattern. So it starts over again. So that means that our period here goes from 0 to 8 pi, which means that that's a horizontal distance of 8 pi. That's my period of this graphed function. Okay, what's the amplitude of this function? Again, amplitude is the distance from the midline up or from the midline down. So this function goes up 3.5 and down 3.5. So my amplitude is 3.5. I'm going to write that as a fraction because that's going to just work better for my brain. And I think for inputting it to Alex, it'll just be easier. So 3.5 as a fraction is 7/2. So that's my amplitude. And then my phase shift, this is where does my period start? Since we started at 0, that means my phase shift is 0 to do this. And the last thing that I want to identify is this a sine graph or is this a cosine graph? Which function does this fit the pattern of? Well, at 0, this starts at 0, and then it goes up, and then it comes back to the baseline, and then it goes down to the bottom, and then it comes back to the baseline. So this pattern matches the pattern of sine. This is going to be a sine function. And we also want to know, is this flipped or is this not flipped? So like, is this a regular sine function or is this an upside down sine function? Because we start at the baseline and we go up, this is a kind of a regular sine function. This is not upside down. So it's just going to be a sine function and my a value is going to be positive. Okay, cool. So now let's start trying to figure out what some of our values for A, B, C, and D are. Hopefully you agree there's no phase shift and there's no vertical shifting here either. So the phase shift being 0 says that C is 0. And there's no vertical shifting. So that tells me that D is 0. So I already know that my function here, when I do it, is not going to have a C or a D. So I really just have to figure out the values of A and B. Okay, so how am I going to do that? Well, I know that the amplitude being 7/2 is the absolute value of A. So the absolute value of A has to be 7/2 in order for my amplitude to be 7/2. And that means that A is going to be either positive 7/2 or negative 7/2. We already said that this is a normal sign function. I don't have to flip it upside down, so it's not going to be negative. That means A is going to be a positive 7/2. And how about a B value? Well, the period will tell us the B value. So the fact that my period is 8 pi, we calculate the period by doing 2 pi divided by B. When I do that, I'm going to get 8 pi because that's the period from this function. So now 2 pi over B has to be 8 pi. So I need to solve for B. So I'm going to multiply both sides by B here to do this algebra. And so when I do that, I'm going to get 2 pi equals 8 pi times B. And then to get to B, I'm going to divide both sides here by 8 pi. So then B is going to be 2 over 8, which is 1/4. So I know that B is 1/4, A is 7/2, and then C and D are both 0. So now I can plug all of this stuff in. Oh, and it's a sine function. So I'm going to plug all of that in, and I know that Y is going to be A, which is a positive 7/2, times the sine of the quantity BX. B is 1/4 times X. Again, C is 0, so I can close that, and D is 0, so that is the end of my equation. So we're just plugging those values into our equation up here. Cool. So now let's try number 2. Again, we're going to have to define our period and our amplitude and our phase shift. So what's the period of this function in number 2? Again, I like to start at 0. I think that's the easiest thing. Let's not introduce a phase shift if we don't have to. And how long does this thing take to finish um, its its cycle? Well, so we aren't repeating yet. Oh, but once we get up here, look, after this, we start repeating the same pattern over again. So this point up here is kind of the end of the line. So I can get rid of this part over here. That is one cycle of my function. So that goes from 0 to 4 pi over 3, which means my period is 4 pi over 3. Okay, what's the amplitude of this function? From the baseline, I go up 4 units, and from the baseline, I go down 4 units. So my amplitude is 4. My phase shift, we started at 0, and is this a sine or a cosine graph as it's written? I don't need to shift left and right to turn it into kind of a sine or cosine pattern. So that means my phase shift is 0 because I don't have to shift it left or right to turn it into a cosine pattern from 0. And is this a sine or a cosine pattern? Well, because I start up, I come back to the baseline, and then I go down, and I come back to the baseline, and I end up. This is a cosine graph. And is it upside down? Nope, this one starts up and regular cosine starts up. This is not upside down, so I know that my A value is going to be greater than 0. It's going to be positive. Okay, so now we can start figuring some of the stuff out. Again, my phase shift is 0, so that means C equals 0. I don't have any vertical shifting, so I know that D equals 0. Biggest thing is I need to figure out what A and B are based on my period and my amplitude. Okay, so let's start with our amplitude. Again, our amplitude is 4. That means the absolute value of A is 4, which means A is either positive 4 or negative 4. But we said that A is greater than 0 because I don't have to flip it upside down. So I know that A is a positive 4. And then I'm going to use my period to help me solve for B. My period, which is 2 pi divided by B. Here, that is 4 pi over 3. So now I have to solve for B. I want to clear these fractions because fractions make me kind of itchy. To do that, I'm going to multiply both sides by the common denominator. If I were to get a common denominator here, it would be 3b. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 3b. Essentially, we're multiplying both sides by both of our denominators to clear them. So on the left, I have 3 times 2 pi, that's 6 pi. And on the right side, I have 4 pi times b. And then to get to b, I'll divide both sides by 4 pi. So that means my b value is 6 divided by 4, which simplifies to 3 over 2. That should be a 2. Try that again. There we go. So my b value is 3/2. And now I can just put this together. It's a cosine function. So we're going to have y equals my a value of 4 times the cosine of b, which is 3/2 times x. And c and d are both 0. So that is the end of my equation. All right. So hopefully this helps you create equations for graphs of trig functions. And I will say that none of these will have a phase shift. So you can always just assume that your C value is going to be 0 here with these. And there won't be any vertical shifting either. The biggest thing is that you have to figure out what your period and your amplitude are and use those things to get A and B. And just pay attention to whether the pattern is a sine or cosine function, and whether it's upside down or not. That will tell you whether A is positive or negative. Okay, I hope that helps. Happy Alexing, and I will see you on Friday.